Revelation chapter 17 tonight. Revelation 17. Are you ready? Are you buckled in? This is a passage of scripture that I have I wouldn't say that I avoided it, but it's been really difficult for me over just the years as I've studied to try to grasp these two chapters. And I've sort of guessed at what I thought it meant. And this is the first time I've done a really in-depth study where I've tried to really compare things in this specific passage. Most of the other passages we've talked about through this series are things that I've studied before and was able to kind of rehash for this series and get a little deeper, expand. Of course, every time you study something, you expand your knowledge a little bit. This is a first for me, teaching through this passage specifically. So I'm not sure what that was, but I guess that's heaven approving of this message. That's what anyway. Did sound like a trumpet. No, man. All right. I was getting excited there. Revelation chapter 17. Here we go. This is the judgment of the great whore or the great harlot. And we're going to talk about how this fits in. Try to keep in mind, we'll try to keep jumping back to some of the other things we studied. This is where Revelation tying into Daniel becomes more important than ever. And you've seen, I think, throughout, as we've studied through Revelation, how important that is, how important that study of Daniel and of Matthew 24 and of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians was. But I think you'll see in a very specific way how very crucial that is as we read this. All right, let's begin. We'll read through it, and then we'll talk about it. Revelation 17 says, "And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show thee the judgment of the great whore, that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication." I'm going to pause for a minute. Macy, will you run to my office? There's 2 sheets of paper sitting on my desk that are my notes for tonight. I need those. Would you get those? Thank you. They should be right there on the front of my desk. Verse 3, "So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee of the mystery of the woman and of the beast." Thank you. Where do we leave off here? Verse 7. Okay, all right. "And of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not, and yet is. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. And the 10 kings which thou sawest are 10 kings, 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. and have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he said unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Well, I think you've probably got it. This is probably fairly simple. We'll just move right along. That chapter's easy, right? What in the world, right? If you're not saying what in the world, then you're a lot smarter than I am, because this is a tough chapter. Let's admit that. So what I want to do tonight is talk about some things. Talk about the prophecy itself. Break it down, what it actually says. Then the prophecy gives us an interpretation. Now, the interpretation isn't exactly clear, but it's an interpretation. So we can start saying, okay, here's some things we know for sure about the interpretation of the prophecy. And then we can go a little bit further and say, here's a few things we can conclude reasonably from what we're told. And then we'll go a little further and we'll say, okay, here's some things that might also be the case. Then we'll piece it all together and give some possibilities of how this could possibly look. And that's mostly imagination built on what we know. But let's start with what we know, okay? That's a good place to start. Now, chapter 18, for reference, is just a description of the destruction of Babylon. Now, remember, this harlot, which is an unfaithful woman, right? This unfaithful woman is called Mystery Babylon the Great. Mystery Babylon the Great. Now, just a few chapters earlier, in chapter 11, remember that the 2 witnesses are killed, and it says that their bodies hang in the street of a city, and the city is called spiritually Sodom and Gomorrah, but the city is actually Jerusalem. So it's the city of Jerusalem, but spiritually it's like Sodom and Gomorrah. And so when it says Mystery Babylon, we could be talking about the actual city of Babylon, or, based on the context already in Revelation, we could be talking about another city that's acting and behaving like Babylon, which is kind of what we had in chapter 11, right? So it's not jumping to any conclusions to say this might not actually be the city of Babylon. As a matter of fact, I'm going to suggest that it's a city that is in existence today. Babylon is not. It's just ruins. The last inhabitants of it were the American military, according to what I read online. When they invaded Iraq, they set up a base on the ruins of the ancient city of Babylon. Interesting. So whether that has prophetic implications, I have no idea. I'm sure some people thought it did at the time. But anyway, the passage here, let's break this down, and we'll say here's what we know about this vision that he saw, and then we'll talk about the interpretation he's given. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. It says that verse 3, he carried me away. First of all, he says he's going to show the judgment of the great whore, and in the end of the chapter, this unfaithful woman is destroyed by kings. And then chapter 18 is all about the destruction of Babylon, which some would say that's not Mystery Babylon, that's actual Babylon. And others would say, no, this is the same thing. It's all talking about the same thing. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what we're getting to is the destruction of this city or these cities. Okay? Now, let's look at what it says. It says that, verse 3, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, we've seen this beast before, haven't we? We saw the beast in chapter 13 with 7 heads and 10 horns. And now we're told, in addition to the 7 heads and the 10 horns, it's the name of blasphemy. Well, what happened in chapter 13? It was the blasphemy of the beast who claimed to be God, and the false prophet caused everyone to worship him. So this is building, Revelation is building on itself, right? This is why you can't just jump to a chapter in Revelation and say, I got it, right? Because you're going to have to see how Revelation kind of builds on itself. And in chapter 13, we see this exact beast that is declaring himself to be God and is worshipped as God, and you take the mark if you don't worship him. If you don't worship him as God, then you don't have the mark, so he knows, so he can kill you. And now here's the same beast, and he's full of blasphemy, right? So this is definitely the same beast. Okay. All right. So there we go. We have her sitting on this beast, and it says in verse 1 that the great horse sits on many waters. Now it's going to interpret that for us later. Just make a note of that. She's on waters. She's in the wilderness. I think the significance of the wilderness probably is that this is talking about something on the earth. The idea so far is that John has been seeing things in heaven, and from the perspective of heaven, he's seen thunders and lightnings and hail in heaven in the 7th trumpet, and he's seeing all these things in heaven. And now he's carried to the wilderness, which means he's on the earth. This is not a vision in heaven. There's a vision on the earth. Okay, so then it says that the beast has 7 heads and 10 horns, and it says that this woman, is Mystery Babylon in verse 5. Now she's decked in purple and scarlet, and this is verse 4, and gold and precious stones and pearls, and having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. So she is rich, right? She has wealth, and she is specifically called a fornicator, a harlot, a whore. She is unfaithful, right? This is a woman who's supposed to be faithful to a man who is not faithful. That's the idea, that's the picture that's being drawn here. To give you an idea of where we see this in, let me save that for later. I'm going to come back around to that idea. Just hang on to that thought, and I want to try to give this to you in a logical progression to help you. So if I go too many places all at once, it gets confusing. Okay, she's also the mother. She's not just a harlot. She's the mother of harlots, it says, and of abominations of the earth. And she has killed many saints. This is what we know about the woman. All right. So she's got this name, Mystery Babylon. Now, we'll talk about this in a minute, but let's look at what the Scripture says is the interpretation of this vision. All right. So let's talk about the interpretation. And this starts. Oh, by the way, in verse 6, she's killed saints. She's killed the martyrs. And so John is like, what in the world is this, right? And the angel says unto him, wherefore didst thou marvel? I'm thinking the angel has never been a human before. And how come you don't understand this, John? You just saw the vision. And he says, wait a minute, I don't understand any of this. So he says this, and the angel said unto me, wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was and is not. Now, he's about to give the interpretation. Now, here's where I think some people who study the book of Revelation really fall short. I mean, really short. So, as I've explained in my study, I've listened to other preachers and other teachers who take different views other than the pre-millennial view. They'll take the amillennial view. Does anyone remember how the amillennial view views Revelation? What is their view of Revelation? Does anyone remember? Luke said he's ready for the quiz. Do you remember? It's all figurative. That's right. They take an idealist approach to Revelation. So everything in Revelation is just the pictures of the kinds of things that we deal with today, and none of it's future prophecy. Well, except for when Jesus returns, that, right? But everything else is just a picture of the kinds of things that we're dealing with today. Well, so when an amillennial gets to Revelation chapter 17, where there's this picture, this vision, and the angel interprets it not as things that we deal with today, as a very specific set of circumstances. The amillennial says, yes, but see, that interpretation is also a figure of the things that we deal with today. Even the interpretation isn't actually literal. And I just say, well, if that's the way you're going to approach Bible study, then I just don't know what to do with you. I mean, if you're going to say that the vision is figurative, I can get on board with that. It's a vision, right? But then when the angel says, okay, but here's the interpretation of that figurative vision, and you say, yeah, but that interpretation is figurative, I say, all right, you've gone a little bit too far off the deep end. And what it is, and we are all guilty of this from time to time, is the amillennial has decided already what they believe. And this doesn't really fit. So they've got to make it fit, and they're going to do that however it works. So sad to say, we all do it sometimes, though, so we need to always be on guard about where we do these things in our own life. But anyway, so here's some things that is told to John as the interpretation. It doesn't give us all of the understanding, but it clears some things up at least. So verse 8, the beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit. Now remember that the dragon empowered the beast, and the dragon later in Revelation is going to be thrown into the bottomless pit. And in chapter 13, the beast ascended out of the bottomless pit. And remember, he had a wound. He was there, he was alive, he was wounded, and then he came back to life, right? Or something to that nature. Maybe he was wounded and looked like he was dead and then came back, or whatever. So this is definitely the angel saying, well, you should know that this beast is the one I said that you saw in chapter 13, right? So this is obviously what he's saying. Then it says, and he shall go into perdition. Well, that's a comforting thing. Remember that all of this is scary if you don't have phrases like that, right? He has an end, right? He's going to perdition. All of this has an appointed end. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. Now again, this is all stuff that was told to us in chapter 13. It's just restating it. So we know that it's the same beast. Okay, verse 9. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. Okay, all right. So the woman, this mystery Babylon, sits on 7 mountains. But the number 7 also stands for something else besides the mountains that the woman sits on. And here's what else it stands for. Verse 10, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and one is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Okay? So the woman, this mystery Babylon, sits on 7 mountains. The number 7 is significant because it's also a representative of a number of kings. And these kings, 5 of them have already passed. And it seems that this is talking about at the time that John is writing the book, which would have been, well, some would argue in the 60s AD, but most would say this was in 96 AD. So in 96 AD, at the end of the first century, when John is writing Revelation, 5 of these have already passed, 1 is currently in place, and 2 are in the future. You say, wait a minute, 5, 6, should be 7. 1 is in the future. Well, that's true, but watch what it says. Okay, the 7 kings, there's 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. There's your 7. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th. Okay, so there's 7, but they all make up this final beast, which is the 8th. Okay, so then the 7 heads not only count for 7 mountains that the woman sits on, but they also count for 7 kings that are in succession. They're not all at one time, like the 10 that we're going to talk about in a minute, but they're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 have already gone. 1 currently is, and then 6 That's number 6. And then 7's in the future. And then 7 ends up turning into 8, right? So that's the idea, okay? Now, don't get too confused. Just take the pieces, and we'll put the pieces together in a minute, okay? Those are our pieces. All right? I will admit, verse 10 is definitely the hardest verse in all of Revelation to interpret. Like, no, I'm in my opinion, okay? Definitely, in my opinion, the hardest verse in all of Revelation to interpret. And I'm going to give you a couple possibilities, but I'm not going to be able to interpret it completely with like absolute certainty for you tonight. But we can draw from it the important things with a great deal of certainty. And so we'll get there, okay? All right, so keep tracking with me. Now we got verse 12. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings. So those 7 heads represent 7 kings, but they're a succession. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is happening when John's writing it, and 7 and then 8 are next. But the horns are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom yet. So at the time John is writing this, they don't exist, or they haven't received their kingdom yet. They're not. You don't look around, John, for this in your time in the first century, because it's not there. Okay, is what they're telling you. They've received no kingdom yet, but they shall receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Now, you might just think about underlining 1 hour and there in verse 12 and short space in verse 10, because I think those are connected, and I will show you that in a minute. But these kings are going to be 1 hour, very short time, and then it says they have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. Are you seeing that from John's perspective, there's a future kingdom with 10 kings that give their power to the beast, and he's also told that from where he is, he's in number 6, and there's a 7 that turns into 8. Does that make sense? So that's 7 and then 8 is probably the 10 kings and their kingdom and the beast and his kingdom, right? So again, still confusing, I know. We're seeing lots of pieces, but I'm trying to give you little hints as we go, and then we'll put it all together. All right? All right, verse 13. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Now, if you're not picking up on the direct line from here to Daniel 7, then you need to go back and watch the video where we did Daniel 7. Right? Because Daniel 7, what happens in Daniel 7? There's the kingdom of Babylon, then there's the kingdom of Persia. Babylon's a lion with wings. Persia's a bear raised up on one side, and Medo-Persia. Then you have Greece, that's a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. And then you have this beast with 10 horns that are said to be 10 kings. 3 of them are conquered in some way by one new horn that rules that beast and that kingdom. And what does he do? He makes war with the saints. So here we have 10 kings which give their power to the beast and make war with the saints. I think that's pretty much obvious parallel right there, that these are talking about the same thing. Okay? Now it says, verse 15. And he said unto me, the waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. Okay, so the world, like from all peoples, is where this comes out of. I think that's a very important point. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will and to agree and to give their kingdom unto the beast until the words, I'm sorry, I skipped one. And the 10 horns, verse 16, which thou hast sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, the mystery Babylon. They're going to hate her and shall make her desolate and naked and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will and to agree and to give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. All right, so the 10 kings attack the the whore, right? Okay, I try not to use the word too much. I don't appreciate the word, but it's the truth. And this is serious language that God is using about a serious problem, okay? So we, at the end of this chapter, are told that she is representative of a city, a great city that reigns over the kings of the earth. Now, so far in this chapter, we're not talking, the present tense is talking about things in the first century. And it says will about things in the future, like future tense. Now, sometimes John is seeing things as if they're happening right now that are in the future, right, throughout the book. But in this chapter, it's, by the way, the 10 kings, they're not yet. They haven't come yet. Oh, you're in the 6th of those heads, John. So John is being told from his perspective, and then he's told that the woman is the great city that currently reigneth over the kings of the earth. So that's a really good reason for us to think that this great whore is the city of Rome. Okay, now let me explain why in a little bit more detail. She sits on seven hills, 7 mountains. Well, everybody in John's day, everybody knew that Rome was also called the city of 7 hills. It was built on 7 hills. Just no question about it. And we can back up and look at what we know from this prophecy. Not only does it seem very obvious that this is talking about Rome, but remember, in Daniel, what was the 4th empire in the list? It was the Roman Empire. Because Daniel chapter 2 gives us a countdown from the Babylonian Empire until the kingdom of God. It was going to be Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then another kingdom, Rome. And then Daniel chapter 7 gives us the same countdown. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then another mysterious kingdom that's not named, but we can obviously assume it's Rome. Why do we know it's Rome? Because Daniel chapter 9 gives us another different countdown of 490 years, and 483 of them get us to the Messiah coming, Jesus. And when did he come? During the Empire of Rome. So if all the countdowns in Daniel are going to include the kingdom of Rome, and all the other ones are named except for the last one, it's got to be Rome, right? So people try to take this and go all over with it. But Daniel all by itself already tells you that the kingdom is Rome. And now we see this all tied to these 10 kings that are supposed to come through the Roman Empire. So this makes a lot of sense. Plus, it's a woman who is a city and is sitting on 7 hills, 7 mountains. That's Rome. There's just there's no two ways about it. So why is she called Mystery Babylon? And why is she called a harlot? All right, now I'll take you to that place I was going to go to earlier where I didn't want to confuse you. Hosea chapter 1. It takes me listening through some of these arguments like a bazillion times before I finally am like, I think I got that. So then I try to turn around and tell you guys once in like 30 minutes, and it's a challenge. So I hope this is easy to follow. If not, then I'm sorry. I'm doing the best I can. All right, Hosea chapter 1, verse 2. Hosea is told to go find a harlot, an unfaithful woman to marry, who's not going to be faithful to him. And it's because God is bringing condemnation on his people, Israel, for being unfaithful. Verse 2 says, the beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea, and the Lord said to Hosea, go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So, and this is the theme throughout the prophets, God calls his people who are supposed to be worshiping him, who are instead of worshiping him, worshiping false gods, he calls them unfaithful. He says he's going to divorce them, write them a bill of divorcement. He says that they are harlots, that they are adulterous, that they've committed fornication. And this isn't so much said about the cities that were never claimed to follow God. This is really said about those who were chosen and claimed to follow God and aren't. So you might see where I'm going with this, but there's a good case that could be made for this city being connected with religious failure, claiming to be Christian and in fact not being so, right? Now, what is within the city of Rome? There's a little, 109 acres called the Vatican City, where there is a religious institution that sits on many waters. I mean, the Catholic Church is all around the globe. Something like, I think it's something like 1 or 2 billion people. I think it's something 1.5 or 1.3 billion people in the world are influenced, or not just influenced, are call themselves Catholic. I mean, the reach and the stretch of that one church, right? It's not too far off from those who call themselves Protestant, but Protestant isn't all controlled by one head, right? There's this group over there, that group over there. There's just so many of them that it's not all this one powerful arm. But think of the power of the Roman Catholic Church. And guess what they do when they make a declaration? They say, Rome has said, right? They call it Rome. It's funny how the Vatican is called Rome, because it's in the middle of Rome. And of course, if you know anything really about history, medieval history, you know that what happened at about the 4th century, 325, when Constantine decided that Christianity would no longer be persecuted, he started seeing a real vested interest that the Roman government had in the success of the church. And so he started not just, refusing to persecute Christians. Instead, he actually started encouraging Christianity. He didn't make it the state religion, that was later. But he did, when there were squabbles among the Christian churches, what did he do? He said, well, let's get together and have a conference to decide it. And he presided as a pagan king over the Council of Nicaea, which wasn't the Catholic Church, but it was how the Catholic Church sort of started becoming what it is today. And in 325 is when that council started. That was probably when you started seeing this happen. The Bishop of Rome, who became the most important bishop because, he's in charge of the church that's right next to the emperor, and the emperor is sort of giving him a lot of importance in Christianity, starts to grow in power, and the emperor starts to go down this way. And the next thing you know, it's the Bishop of Rome who's sort of running the empire several hundred years later, and the emperor is nothing. Because how is the emperor, now that the empire is turning Christian, how's the emperor going to go against the bishop, right? He can refuse him entrance into heaven if he wants to, right? So they've got to grovel at the feet of the Pope, of the Bishop of Rome. He wasn't called the Pope until later, when they called the Pope in the 4th century. But you see how this sort of grew, and then the next thing you know, it became the Holy Roman Empire by 1000 or so A.D. And then you've got the emperor gone, the Roman Empire is gone. Now it's the Catholic Church, and of course they started going way beyond their authority and. In the scriptures, not that they hadn't already gone beyond it, but they went just so far beyond it that people like Martin Luther just said this is ridiculous and broken. That's where you have the Protestants. That's a very short summary of church history, but this is what happened. So you have that Roman Empire. Remember that Daniel said it was going to last for a long time, and then there was going to be a second part of it, right? There was going to be a second part that was like iron mixed with clay. Well, here we go. Here is what seems to be the city of Rome that's killed saints, and the Catholic Church has done that, and is the mother of harlots, should be serving and worshiping God, but isn't. And she's called Mystery Babylon. Okay, this I think is important, because where did Babylon begin? Anyone know? The Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel. All right? So the Tower of Babel is an interesting study, and there are some things out there that just don't seem to have historical data to back it up. In the 1800s, somebody came up with this idea that the Tower of Babel was where this myth started about Tammuz and Nimrod and the pagan deities, and that actually doesn't have any, as far as I can find, any actual historical data to back that up. Just somebody came up with it in the 1800s. However, there was a guy named Nimrod who did seem to be the guy who started the Tower of Babel. And what happened at the Tower of Babel? It was people who were descendants of Noah, right, who should have been worshiping God, and they said, no, we're going to reach up to God. We're going to be gods to ourselves. We don't need God. They turned away from the God they should have been worshiping. They were spiritual whores, right? They turned away. They were unfaithful to God, right? And so this happened at the Tower of Babel, and this was very prevalent in the empire of Babylon. And they did, in the empire of Babylon, worship a false god named Tammuz, which they thought was, sort of this pagan female deity, Anyway, so all that pagan stuff did become very, very much part of Babylon, of the city of Babylon. And Babylon was basically the first world government. The first government in the world. Not a world empire. The first world empire, you could probably point to Egypt. But the first, government came from Hammurabi in Babylon. Hammurabi's code, right? He's the first one to have a written law that we know of. And so this is what made Babylon great, is this system of government that it developed. Well, this brings us to the question, who are the seven heads, right? Because this is a hard question. And some people would say the seven heads are different emperors of Rome up until the time of John. To give you an idea, that would be, you have Augustus, but they would probably, in order to make the number work, they'd probably start with since the time of Jesus. So they'd probably start with Tiberius, who was the emperor of Rome during the time of Jesus, then Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, and then, because we already have 5, they'd probably skip the next 2 because they were all in 1 year just trying to vie for the throne after Galba, and go straight to Vespasian, who might have been the emperor during the time when John wrote, but probably wasn't actually. So there's number 6. And then you got Titus and Domitian, and Domitian was probably Domitian. I don't know how to pronounce it. Anyway, he was the emperor probably when John was writing. So it doesn't really work. You can try to say, well, maybe it's just the key figures of the Roman. You could try to get there, but it doesn't quite work. I think what's more compelling, an argument about these kings, is that they are what we see in Daniel 7. Remember, Daniel 7 gives us kings and kingdoms, and the word king is interchangeable with his kingdom. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, it says, you are the head of gold, but it was really his whole kingdom that was the head of gold. He was that figurehead of his kingdom. So when it says 7 kings, it's probably talking about 7 kingdoms. Now, there's a couple ways you can get there, but I think probably the most compelling one that I've heard would be the idea that there have been world empires since the Tower of Babel, since government started. And those world empires were Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia. Run out of fingers with this in my hand. Greece, that's 5. And then Rome would be 6, right? So then you've got all 6. And John, of course, is writing during the time of Rome, which would be the 6th. And then you've got 2 more left. The 7th, which sort of becomes the 8th. The 7th is a world empire led by 10 kings who turn against Rome, the city of Rome, conquer it, apparently, and give their power to the beast. And that's the 8th. Right? Okay, so some of this is we know for sure, some of it's assumptions, right? We know for sure this is all tied to Rome somehow. We don't know exactly who the 7 heads are, but we do know from the time of John forward, there's 2 left, and it seems very obvious that those next 2 are the 10 kings and their kingdom, that they give to the beast. And that's why it says there's 7 heads, but it's all the beast, because it all just sort of becomes the beast's kingdom. Okay? So then what we have is this loose idea. And this is going to be a little bit of imagination added to what we can see here. I think there's a really compelling reason to think that the reason Rome is called this great prostitute here is because of a spiritual prostitution that takes place from the Catholic Church. Now, someone might say, well, this is in the future. I don't know that all of this is in the future. But that, if I was a Catholic, I'd probably argue that. Yeah, so the Catholic Church gets perverted later, right? Maybe, I don't know. But here's the thing. When the rapture takes place, and, we've taught about how the rapture takes place before all of this, what do you think happens to the people who are left? I mean, we've got millions of people, maybe even 1 billion people. I don't know how many Christians, genuine believers there are on the earth right now. But if you have 1 million or millions and millions, maybe even up to close to 1 billion people gone from the earth, that's going to be a serious crisis on the earth. I mean, just people gone. Imagine especially nations that are highly, evangelized, where lots of people are gone. What are they going to do? There's going to be this outcry, and it's very possible that a system, a network of churches like the Catholic Church, whatever's left after the rapture, because, some of them are going, I suppose. I know some Catholics who I believe are genuinely saved, but I do believe that the majority of them are not. But whatever's left after the rapture of that Catholic Church seems like it would be a perfect way to unify the world under one government, wouldn't it? Right? And so you would see, it's conceivable to see 10 kings, 10 rulers sort of rising to take control of the world, but everybody unifies kind of under a place like the Catholic Church or Rome. And so they sort of take control of the world, but who's really in charge? Well, it's the church. And so the 10 kings aren't really happy about that, and they want to give their kingdom to this new guy, the beast. He's convinced them that they want to give their kingdom to him. So they turn against Rome, attack it, and destroy it, and then take control of this world government. That's a really general and a little bit of imaginative way to put this together, but it fits, doesn't it? Or I think it does. Now, what happens next? Why is there a destruction of Babylon later? Well, I think then the chapter 18 is talking about the destruction of Babylon that happens at the end of the tribulation, what we talked about last week. When the vial judgments are poured out, there's darkness on the kingdom of the beast, there's spoils and sores and all this stuff. I think that is a second destruction of, I think, probably the same city. They sack Rome, they take control, they conquer it, they destroy whatever spiritual authority is there, because they can't have some claim of worshiping Christ in their city when they're going to try to worship the Antichrist. And then this becomes the base of operations, or it seems so, and that would fit with everything else we studied, wouldn't it? About how the beast is in charge of the Roman Empire. So then, at the end of everything, God sends destruction on them again. And here's another reason why I think this has to be, even in chapter 18, we have to be talking about Rome and not about the actual Babylon. And I'll just give you one verse here, and we'll close with this. Verse 17, all this is just talking about how devastating it is to the world when God destroys it. Verse 17, for in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught, and every shipmaster and all the company in ships and sailors, as many as trade by sea, stood afar off, and cried when they saw the smoke of her burning. There's a group of people here who are specifically affected by the destruction of Babylon, this, I would call it Mystery Babylon, even in chapter 18. And the people are people who trade by sea. Now, if you know geography, you know Babylon is not a city on the sea. It's on a river. It's on the Euphrates River, right? But it's not on the sea. Rather, Rome is a city on the sea. It's only 2 miles from the sea. The reason Rome became as powerful and as rich as it became is because of sea trading. Babylon never became powerful from sea trading. They became powerful from their government system, right? The Empire of Babylon. So I think we're still in chapter 18 talking about the city of Rome. Now, so you say, well, what does this matter? What does all this mean? The point is that when we see prophecies in Daniel and in Matthew and all these other things leading up to it, it makes it a lot easier to interpret what we see in the book of Revelation. And when we see all these pieces starting to move in place in our world today, I was talking to someone today about how, man, it looks like there's all these different factions in the world that are trying to create a one world government. And I said, yeah, that's sounding less and less like a conspiracy theory and more like just like a truth theory, right? It looks like that's what's people are trying to do. We see, wait a minute, this is all part of the plan, right? Now, it's possible that God steps in and stops it all from taking place and says, no, we're going to wait. It might be another 100 years before he returns. Or it's also possible that he says, all right, it's time. And I'm hoping it's that. I sure am. But anyway, the point is that God is in control. Nothing is outside of his understanding, his knowledge. He knows it's all going to happen. And get this, because of what we seem to have as a timeline here, we don't know when in this timeline the 7 years starts or when the rapture takes place. Right? The 10 kings could come to power before the rapture. It's possible. It says that these 10 kings are for a short time. And remember that 7th kingdom is just for a short time. And then the kings only have power for an hour, like a really short time before they give it over to the beast. So if they come to power, it's just about time. But it's possible that we, in our lifetime, still live through some really dark times. We might see a one-world government in our lifetime as God allows things to set the stage for it. Or we might be raptured before it happens, and all this takes place in a few months or the first couple years of that 7 years. We don't know at what point the Antichrist makes that treaty with many people that includes Israel. That's going to last for 7 years, but halfway through he's going to make an abomination. We don't know if that's part of him getting the 10 kings on his side, or at what point, and we don't know how long before that the rapture takes place. We don't. There's a lot of things we don't know. Okay, as far as the timeline here. So what are we to do? Just trust that God has it all in control. We're not supposed to know. We're just supposed to know that when we're seeing all these things happen, it's not a surprise. It's not ruining the plan. It's God saying, yeah, this is all happening as I expected. And we think everything's falling apart. And from our perspective, it is. Our nation seems to be falling apart, and the world seems to be falling apart, but God says, no, it's falling into place. This is what has to happen. Father in heaven, I thank you so much for your goodness. I thank you that we can trust in your guidance and leadership. And Lord, I pray that you'd help us as we try to meditate and consider all of these things. Help us to better understand your word, even though we acknowledge that there's so much here that we just cannot possibly know for sure. But we can find in the things that you do declare to us a confidence and a reassurance that you're in control and it's all going as planned. And we thank you for that. We trust that you are sovereign in these things. That's a good question. I think that's tying it in to whatever the wounded unto death thing was in chapter 13. And we don't know. But remember that Daniel talked about the legs of iron and then the feet of iron and clay, as if there were two parts to this last kingdom. And then he goes into, and he specifically mentions the toes and the feet. And then he goes in chapter 7 to talk about 10, and there's 10 toes on people's feet, 10 kings in this last kingdom that will rule in the latter part of it. So it seems like there are two parts to the Roman Empire. And I mean, if there is a Roman Empire in the future, as is prophesied, then there's two parts to it because it's kind of gone now. So I think what we're seeing then, if we're seeing a wounded unto death and then coming back, it could very well be talking about the Roman Empire. Being wounded, gone, or mostly gone, it's kind of still alive in the Roman Catholic Church, and then coming back. It also could be the actual Antichrist, because remember, when we're talking about the beast, sometimes it talks about the kingdom, and sometimes it's talking about the man, the Antichrist. So it could be talking about the Antichrist himself, who appears to be dead, or maybe even is dead and comes back to life. I don't think the devil has power to bring people back from the dead, so I think it would be appearing to be dead and then appearing to come back to life, which would explain why everybody is in awe and wonder and worships him after that. And you say, well, which one is it? I don't know. Could be both. Could be talking about both the Roman Empire and, that's sort of like a picture of the guy. Like they both do that. I would probably tend to say both, but we'll see when it happens. Anyone else? Okay, very good. We covered a lot of ground, long one I know today, but I appreciate you letting me get all my notes out on you. And next week we'll do a little review and then talk about the return of Christ, because I think we're all very familiar with the fact that Jesus is returning, but we don't want to skip over that, but we want to tie it in and conclude it all, and then we get to go on into what happens after that. The real stuff, like the real good stuff, the stuff that we're waiting for, right? We get so interested in how it's all going to play out for those 7 years, but that's like a flash in the pan, and then we get what we're waiting for, right? The good stuff, So we're going to talk about that and for a couple weeks, hopefully, afterward, and be done.